Another issue I think to bear in mind is that the procedures themselves can actually bias us from the outset, even though we don't realize it. And it took me quite a while to kind of figure that one out. So the tools themselves kind of restrict us. They only allow us to do certain things. They don't allow us to do everything, obviously. They're all kind of finite in what they allow us to do. And the tools themselves are not biased, but the people who designed the people who designed the tools are biased as well. So they've kind of incorporated their own biases and interests into the way that they've created those tools. So those tools may lead us down certain paths or put us in certain mindsets or ways of thinking. So to give an example, let's take the keywords technique again. So as you know from before, a keyword is a word which is statistically more frequent in one corpus when we compare it against another corpus. Sometimes a similar corpus or sometimes a bit bigger reference corpus. And one criticism of this technique is that it just tells us about differences. It tells us these words occur more in this text, these words occur more in this text. It's not telling us anything about what's similar between the two sets of files or the two corpora. And some people may say, well, actually, the similarities are actually where the most exciting stuff is. Maybe the similarities are more important. Maybe there are more similarities between the two sets of keywords than there are differences. And if we focus on differences, we're kind of, in a sense, kind of perpetuating this kind of difference discourse, whereas that's maybe only part of the story. Also,
there's another problem with keywords.
Yes.
They are based on frequency, and that's also an assumption that something which is more frequent
is important, and maybe it's not. Maybe what's not frequent is important.
Maybe the source is more important than the frequency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Another issue is that the tools only generally allow us to compare two things together at the same time. So that can maybe restrict us a little bit. And I'll refer back to when I was talking about that corpus of articles of Muslims, which I talked about last time. Now, it's quite interesting comparing different newspapers. I thought, does the Guardian talk about Muslims differently to the Daily Mail, for example? It does. So I thought, I'll split my corpus up and then do a keyword comparison. And I thought, well, Wordsmith only lets me do it two ways. I can only have one set versus another set. So I thought, well, I'll do it tabloids versus broadsheets. I'll do a kind of comparison that way to begin with. Which got some really interesting things that came out of it. But there were some problems. So I thought, well, a Daily Mail actually it's more of a middle market newspaper. It's not really a proper tabloid. So I want a third set of comparisons, but I couldn't really work out how I was going to do it to begin with using Wordsmith. So I think we need more sophisticated methods and tools maybe in order to look at things like similarity or to compare lots of corpora together to spot what's going on. And I think if you're very clever at computer programming or maths, you can get around this. If you're not so much, if you're a beginner, maybe it's harder and you end up sticking with what's there, and then you end up doing maybe analysis which has led you down a certain path. There are ways to solve the keywords kind of problem though. I've got some diagrams to show you how I did it in the end. So this figure shows a typical way that Wordsmith or AntConc works. We've got corpus 1, corpus 2, we do a keywords comparison of the two, and we get two lists of keywords, one which is more frequent in corpus 1, one which is more frequent in corpus 2. Well, we could maybe do it this way instead. We've got our corpus 1 and corpus 2, maybe they're newspaper articles about Muslims. We compare it against the big reference corpus, maybe something like the BNC, or a big reference corpus of just general newspaper articles from the same time period, not just about Muslims, but about everything. So again, we do two separate lots of keywords comparisons, and we get two separate keyword lists again, but there may be some similarities between corpus 1 and corpus 2 in terms of the keywords that come out, as well as some differences in terms of the keywords. So that's maybe going to give us a fuller picture. An issue may occur that we may not have a very good reference corpus there. Our original corpora may be so big it's really hard to find an even bigger reference corpora, or one which is of the right time period or the right genre, things like that. I think often people use the BNC as a reference corpus, but as we've seen, it is a bit old now, and so maybe we're going to get keywords which are more to do with historical differences, and they may interfere with our results. So another option, well, we can do this with more than one if we want to, more than two, so we could do it with 4 corpora. The other option is maybe that we take our 4 corpora and we sort of do something which is called the remainder effect. So we compare a subsection of a corpus against the rest, the remainder of that corpus, to get the keywords. So imagine these 4 corpora together are 4 different newspapers, maybe the Sun, the Guardian, the Mail, and the Times. If we wanted to see what are the keywords in just the Sun, we compare it against the Mail, the Times, and the Guardian, sort of we add that together as one big corpus. And we can do that as many times as we want to, so we could maybe just compare corpus 2 against corpus 1 plus 3 plus 4, or corpus 4 we could compare against 1 plus 3 plus 2, and so on. Does that make sense?
You add them together and make them into one?
Yeah, yeah.
2 and 3 and 4.
2 and 3 become one big corpus. We get a frequency list for just 2 and 3 and 4 together. We compare that frequency list against the frequency list for corpus 1 at the top. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's a very simple question.
No.
Yeah.
Well, if you're using a tool like Wordsmith or AntConc, you just basically select those files and build a word list of all of those files together. Some tools won't let you do that, potentially, but some will. So I think the point is that the corpus tools don't always allow us to do what we want. I think it's useful to be aware of what they do let us do and maybe reflect on that. If we can get around it, think about that, or use a different tool, or try and do some sort of workaround as suggested here. But it's just something to be aware of. It's not something that you necessarily have to do, but it's something to bear in mind when you're writing your stuff up. But it's not to say that all of the tools are kind of forcing us into a different mindset anyway. And one tool that I like a lot, and I know some of you have used this already, is something called Sketch Engine, which is developed by Adam Kilgareth. It's a website-based tool. I think you have to pay a subscription to use it, which is why I don't teach it in this course anymore, so you have to pay for it. But I quite like it, and particularly in the way that it works with collocates, and it does some very clever and interesting things with collocation analysis, which is quite sophisticated. And I'm going to show you this in order to try and demonstrate this. So imagine you're looking at collocates of girl and boy, and you're looking at discourses around gender, you've picked on girl and boy, you're going to compare the collocates and kind of work out what's happening. Well, Sketch Engine allows you to compare 2 words together and get the collocates up, and it will tell you which words are statistically more likely to occur as collocates just for girl or just for boy, or which ones are sort of just shared collocates, so they're similarities. So here, it's done this as kind of color-coded. The things in red occur more as collocates for boy, the things in green occur more as collocates for girls, and the things that are just left blank are kind of things where there's not really a statistical significant difference there. And you can actually see that, particularly for the subject, that column in the middle. Most of these are actually, there's not that much difference. There's quite a lot of overlap in terms of the collocates for girl and boy. So we might want to kind of have a story or a narrative when we write this up that actually there's a lot of similarity. There are some differences though, and those are kind of worth mentioning as well. So I think it's about putting things difference into perspective alongside similarity. So let's have a look. I think these ones at the bottom are quite interesting here. Girls tend to dance, giggle and marry quite a lot. Boys don't do that so much. You don't get giggling boys, but you get giggling girls. It's interesting that girls marry but boys don't. I think that's obviously to do with, girls are too young to marry, but women often get referred to as girls. And that's why I think they get described as marrying. Boys, men don't as often get described as men. What I also like about this is it tells you about collocates in terms of their relationships. So it tells you when a collocate is acting, in a subject position or kind of an object position, or whether it's acting in terms of an adjective or something else. So that's why we've got these different sets of boxes here. This is only a very small part of the whole analysis, which kind of runs off the bottom of the screen. So in terms of that last table, boys tend to get called autistic in this corpus. Girls never get called autistic. But then we've got all of these green ones where girls are described as jealous, hysterical, adorable, pretty, underage, topless, pregnant, etc. Some of these maybe we'd expect. We'd expect to see girls described as pregnant. So though, again, maybe it's more to them being women than girls. But things like gorgeous, jealous, why are they the domain of girls than boys? There's something happening here as well. So again, it's about, I think, kind of interpreting this in terms of what's similar but what's also different, and kind of putting that into perspective at the same time. Okay, moving on to look more at analysis now, rather than method itself. I'll start off by saying something about how we report findings within corpus linguistics. This especially applies to things like when we're looking at concordance line data and trying to summarize it, but it can also apply to collocates or keywords or frequencies or anything where numbers are involved. And I'd always say, I tell my PhD students this, give the exact figures and proportions and the sample size when you report numbers. So, if you're looking at 981 concordance lines of the word girl, you find that 280 of them refer to girls expressing negative emotions. You need to put those numbers in, and it's usually a good idea to express it, I usually put it in brackets, as a proportion, as a percentage, so 28.5% there. You know, give as much kind of numerical information as you can, I think. If you didn't look at all 981 lines, you just looked at a sample, maybe 100 lines, say what your sample size was as well and explain why you had that sample size. I think occasionally, and sometimes when you're repeating yourself a bit later on, I think maybe in a conclusion, you've already given those figures and a bit later you want to kind of refer to them again or kind of summarize them. It's okay, I think, to use phrases like a quarter of or the majority of or about half, things like that. I think as long as the figures are elsewhere. But I'd say never use these words here. Don't say some, several, many, quite a lot, or a few. They're far too vague. And I know this may seem a really obvious kind of thing, but I have seen, my students have done that. They've put things like that in. And I've had to say, no, give the numbers, please. So that's something to bear in mind anyway. Okay, considering we know how to describe our results, what about how we make sense of them? How do we interpret them? And I think one way that this can go wrong, and particularly I think when you're doing this for the first time, is that you can maybe do something called under-interpretation. Now Stubbs and Gerbig describe this as counting what is easy to count. I think Gabrielatus calls it frequency worship, and it's kind of where you kind of go over the top with the numbers. But that's the level that you leave it at. So you're kind of over-relying on the techniques of corpus linguistics, and you feel like the techniques themselves are actually the analysis, but they're not. They're kind of the way in to the analysis. So imagine we have a corpus of text about 9/11, the 9/11 attacks. And we start off, we say, I'm going to do a frequency list. I'm going to be corpus-driven. I'm going to see what the frequencies of the words are. And you get a table like this one here. And then underneath it, you have your interpretation. You say, frequently, 9/11 is written about in terms of bin Laden, in terms of terrorism, in terms of America, New York, things like that. And I have had students do that. And then they presented it to me and said, here's my analysis. And I said, well, it's not actually analysis. You're just telling me what's there. And also, it's a kind of so what finding. It's not telling us anything that I couldn't have told you myself, or anybody who, a child could tell me this. It's not. There's nothing really very exciting there. And I think when people do read analyses, they like to be told something they don't already know. Otherwise, they feel they're wasting their time a bit. So I think this maybe serves as a way into the analysis. Maybe it's interesting here that bin Laden's mentioned, and other people are not mentioned in the top 10. People like Bush are not mentioned, or Blair. But I think you need to look maybe at some of these words in a lot more detail. So looking at bin Laden, how is he represented? What sort of metaphors or constructions are written around him? How is he described as doing certain things or having certain things done to him? Is it different depending on different sections of the text? So is an American text writing about him differently from, say, a British text? That sort of question. I'd also maybe look at some of these and think, well, are any of these in here which I can't really explain? And maybe they're worth focusing on a little bit more detail to see if something interesting comes out. So the word people and the word time I thought were quite interesting potentially. It may just be that these are very frequent words, and if you look at any top 10 of anything, they're going to come up maybe in the top 50 or something like that in any corpus. But I wasn't sure why they were there, and I thought maybe that could be something, a kind of direction to take. But this is the start of the analysis. It's not the analysis in itself, and just describing it is not the analysis either. You have to kind of explain it and interpret it in a lot more detail. Now, the opposite of underinterpretation, and this is when we tend to get a little bit better at the analysis, I think. This is when I see students who are not doing it the first time, they're kind of on their second or third kind of attempt, is over-interpretation. And this involves, you're reading about CDA, you know about language more, and then you start making claims. You say, I've spotted this feature, it's happening a lot, and it means this. But you kind of over-interpret. You don't maybe look at it in enough detail, and the interpretation is too strong. It's too much. So, for example, some people argue that passive sentence structures are problematic in language because they obscure the agent, and this can be used for ideological purposes. So think about a sentence like, I don't know, John attacked Tom. That's a nice active sentence. We know who did the attacking, we know who got attacked. But we can switch this. We can say, Tom was attacked by John, and again we know who did the attacking, we know who was attacked. But we could also say, with a passive sentence, Tom was attacked, full stop. And we've got rid of John. We don't know who attacked him. And some people say that passive sentences are used ideologically to kind of remove the agent, particularly when we don't want to blame the agent. So if the government do cuts or something, or somebody that we don't like has murdered somebody, or we do like but we don't want to really press the point home, we take the agent away, we write it as a passive sentence. And there are reasons maybe that we do that. But just because we can do it doesn't mean it's always used with this ideological reason to manipulate us and make us think something that we shouldn't. So here's some cases of people being attacked and arrested in the BNC. And there are these kind of passive sentence structures. Now, if we look down this, in numbers 1 and 2, we can see that the person who's doing the attacking is actually mentioned here. So we can say, well, okay, that's not really a case of this agent deletion, so we can ignore those. I think in the bottom 3 lines as well, lines 6 to 8, we know who's doing the arresting by the German police, by the government, by the police. We can forget those as well. But what I'm kind of interested in is lines 3 and 4 and 5, those lines in the middle, where we're not seeing the agent. We don't know who's doing the attacking. We don't know who's doing the arresting. But do we? I mean, the problem with concordance lines is they don't really tell us very much. You only get 5 or 6 words either side. So I think what you need to do is look at paragraphs or full sentences at least. So here's some expansions of those people who are being attacked. And you can see the first one actually, okay, it doesn't, in that first sentence, it doesn't name the attacker, but it does name the attacker in the second sentence, the sentence that comes afterwards. He stabbed his attacker, Martin Day, who was later jailed for 18 months. So agency is there, it's just a bit later on in the text. And so I think, in that case, we've got to say, well, the concordance is not going to tell us maybe the truth. We have to be a bit suspicious of the concordance and go outside it. The bottom example is to have been arrested, and in this case, this is a bona fide case of agent deletion. We're never told who arrested this person. But then I'm thinking, well, do we really need to know who arrested this person? It's pretty obvious it was the police. They do the arresting. So it doesn't really matter that, in this sense, that agency has been taken away. Maybe this is being done for the sake of space, word counts. It's not trying to manipulate us in certain ways. So I think if you want to make a point about agency being obscured in a particular corpus, you think it's a really important thing in that corpus, and you count up the number of times it happens, it's important to go beyond the concordance line and also consider the functions of each case of agent deletion, rather than saying agency deletion happens 56% of times when the verb is used, and that shows this. It may not be actually meaning to show that. It may be some other reason. Okay, another issue relates to, imagine we've got our interpretation, we're kind of pretty okay with it. We know we're not under-interpreting, we know we're not over-interpreting. We then need to move on to evaluating our analysis. On Wednesday I talked about this 4-stage model of description, interpretation, explanation, and evaluation. And one question that I've had come up in my own writing is, how often does something have to happen in a corpus before it kind of raises a red flag and says, that's a problem, that's bad, something's wrong here about this data. So for example, if we're saying that the press are biased against Muslims, how much bias do we need to see before we can say it's a problem and that they actually are biased? Are we allowed for the press to have a little bit of bias? Where's the cut-off point in that particular context? So to give a real-life and very simplified example, when I was looking at my corpus of Muslims in the newspapers, I found out that in a newspaper called The People, 1 in 8 Muslims are described as being extreme. So they're described as extremist Muslims or militant Muslims, things like that. And in The Guardian, this figure is the lowest. It's 1 in 35. So I kind of had that, and I had lots of other figures as well, and I got to my conclusion chapter, and I wrote this sentence. I wrote, "The British press are biased towards Muslims because they tend to over-focus on Muslims who are extreme, or they often associate Islam with extremism." So I'm using the words over-focus and often here. I'm using a kind of frequency judgment, and I'm saying this is a problem, this is bad. So I wrote that, very happily went away, and then later I came back to that chapter and kind of read it through again. I think it's always good to do, and I thought, what am I saying here? Am I right? And I think it's often useful to kind of imagine there's a horrible person who hates you when you read your own stuff back, and I try to think, what would they say about that? And it's a really good way to kind of have this kind of internal critic, and it's very helpful. So I don't just have one of these unpleasant critical, I have about 7 or 8 of them, I think, and they all say different things to me. So, and here they are on this slide. I imagine one person saying, "You're wrong. I know you've kind of focused on these very extreme belief words, and they are higher than the moderate words in the corpus, but actually they're not that high. And even the worst one has 1 in 8 Muslims described as extreme. What about the other 7? They're not being described as extreme. So the majority pattern is actually they're not described as extreme. Why don't you say that? What's the matter with you? If it was 50% or more than 50%, you've got a point. But your 1 in 8 isn't that big. So you're kind of over-focusing on this. You're over-emphasizing this problem." So that's my kind of first person. My second person might say, well, actually, in the real world, the vast majority of Muslims are not extremists. They just go about their lives, having very normal, boring, everyday experiences. And many interpretations of Islam as a religion are not extreme either. So what's happening clearly with these newspapers is that they're extremely biased against Muslims and Islam by over-focusing on these extreme cases far too much. And even 1 in 35 cases is far too high in terms of reporting. And you've actually, your conclusion could be even stronger. You've kind of downplayed it, and you need to be kind of making even more of a fuss about this than you have. And then I thought, well, maybe somebody else kind of says, well, it's kind of really hard to kind of work out, what's extreme and what's not. So maybe we should look at comparing the newspapers together, and we could say, well, actually, The Guardian, that's the best newspaper, the nicest newspaper in kind of using these extreme words. So maybe we'll say that's the kind of benchmark. 1 in 35 cases of Muslims described as extreme is okay. Everything else is a problem. So maybe you need to conclude that not all the newspapers are extreme. Some are extreme, some are not. The Guardian's okay, but the other ones are problematic, and there's a kind of linear scale of problematicness here. So that's one position. A fourth position is maybe saying, well, what's the point of newspapers? They're supposed to report the kind of exciting, horrible things that happen in the world. We're not interested in these boring Muslims who are not extreme. We want to know about these extreme ones. They're the problems. I don't care if there's just one of them. You need to be reporting that person over and over and over again till they change. And you're not giving some of these newspapers are not giving extremist Muslims enough attention. So The Guardian's a problem. It needs to be talking more about extremist Muslims. So that's my other kind of position, another oppositional thing. And then person 5 says, why are you even bothering doing this? Why are you trying to quantify extremism? It's impossible. You're just going to set yourself up for criticism. Don't even bother. Protect yourself from this to start with. Just give the numbers and say, there they are. You figure it out. You decide if this is a problem or not. And I don't know. So that's another position. I don't know if that's a bit of a cop-out. I think, in a way, some people might say it is. And that we're kind of saying, well, here it is. I'm going to be all kind of objective and not kind of interpret it or evaluate it in any way. I'll leave it up to you. I think people who are working within a CDA framework would say that's a cop-out. They'd say, no, you've done this for a reason. Go that extra mile and actually say it's a problem. But as you see, there are lots of ways that people are not going to agree with you, potentially, depending on what their political status is. And it's something to be aware of. Okay, so I want to end on a kind of more hopeful note. I've kind of tried to make it seem more horrible, I think, in the last hour. These are kind of 3 principles which I find quite helpful when I do this type of analysis myself, and they're reflexivity, transparency, and consistency. So transparency involves being, I think, as clear as possible about the choices that you made in terms of your data that you chose, your method, your research questions, your cut-off points, how you decided at certain things, everything. Be as clear as you can. And that can mean openly stating the limitations maybe that were put on you by outside forces. You know, I would have liked to have done all these things. I can't because of word counts, because of time, etc. If you're using a cut-off point, you can cite Susan Hunstone or somebody else. You know, blame her if you want to. That's another way out of doing it. Or say, you know, I'm looking down my keyword list. I'm getting to a point where I'm just seeing the same kind of patterns emerging, so I'm stopping now. That can be another way of doing it. It can mean acknowledging that you're doing something because the corpus tool let you do that, and it wouldn't let you do something else. It also means making as much as your data and analysis available to other people so they can check up on you, even though that's quite a hard thing to do, I think, at times. So it could mean using appendices quite a lot, printing things out and having them in appendices for other people, or having disks with your corpus on. Sometimes you can't give your corpus away because it's, you know, there are copyright issues, but if you can, it's a good idea to make it available to others. Consistency means once you've arrived at a set of decisions about how you're going to do something, you kind of remain faithful to that set of decisions throughout that piece of analysis. So if you're looking at mutual information as collocation, stick with that throughout that particular piece of research. Don't change your cutoffs halfway through to sort of get the results. You know, I really want to look at keyword number 51. It's really interesting, but you know, don't do that sort of thing. And finally, reflexivity, which I think is probably the most important of the three, means thinking about how the different aspects of analysis are likely to have influenced the results. And a lot of this talk has been reflexive in that sense, where I've tried to think about what have I done in the past, and is it actually holding up? Is it, is it convincing? Are people going to think, well, actually, I'm not convinced by what you've done, it falls down. So, maybe reflect on your identity as a researcher, to the topic under investigation. Talk about how you started out with maybe previous knowledge or attitudes that may have influenced what you noticed or found interesting. And I have been called out on this myself when I think I've overdone it. I remember I gave a talk a while ago, I think in February in Portsmouth. I said, I'm doing a corpus approach. I've collected all the data of Muslims in the press, and I'm being very neutral. I don't know what I'm going to find. I'm going to be corpus driven and get keywords. I have no hypotheses or theories about what's in this. I'm kind of naive in a sense. And someone in the audience said, actually you're not though, because why did you look at Muslims in the first place? You must have had some idea there was something up there, so you can't be naive. And I kind of had to say, yeah, you're right. Actually, I was suspicious. So I said, I was naive in the sense of the methods I used were naive. I wasn't going in there saying, I'm going to prove they're biased. But there was a sort of a level of naivety, I think, and I was kind of maybe overdoing it and overstating the issue there. So it's important not to do that. Reflexivity can also involve triangulation, so maybe using more than one method of analysis, approaching the same thing from different perspectives. Triangulation can also involve talking to other people, so it can involve giving presentations to people and hearing their feedback, even if they don't agree with you, and trying to take it on board if it's useful. So I think whenever you present, there's an element of reflexivity there, and I'd say present as much as you can. If you don't want to present, get people who you trust to read your stuff and comment on it a lot. And that's part of the analysis.